The grand hall of the Vincennes Hotel buzzed with laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the hum of polished conversations. Every detail of the evening had been meticulously curated. Handcrafted floral arrangements lined the tables, a live string quartet played softly in the background, and waiters in crisp uniforms moved seamlessly through the crowd, refilling glasses with expensive wine. It was an evening meant to celebrate success. Not just for the company, but for me and Eric. 15 years of marriage. A milestone. At least, that's what he had let me believe. Eric stood across the room, effortlessly charming the executives that hung onto his every word. He was magnetic in that tailored black tuxedo, a picture of wealth and power. To the outside world, he was the brilliant CEO, the man who had transformed his family's once modest business into a corporate empire. But I knew better. He had never built an empire. He had inherited it. He had never earned the respect of his peers. He had bought it. And his charm? That effortless confidence that made him so beloved in these circles? It was just that, an act. I watched him raise his whiskey glass in a toast, laughing at something one of the board members had said. From a distance, he looked exactly like the man I had fallen in love with years ago. But love had been a long-buried emotion for me. It had been replaced, slowly and painfully, by something colder. Betrayal does that to a person. I lifted my own glass, the golden champagne inside shimmering under the chandelier's warm glow. A careful, practiced smile curved my lips as I took a slow sip, savoring the way the bubbles fizzed against my tongue. This would be a night to remember. Then, Eric stepped onto the stage. A hush fell over the room as the sound of his glass clinking against a fork rang through the space. Conversations died down. The music softened. The spotlight found him, casting a halo of light around the man who, for years, had carefully crafted the illusion of perfection. He smiled, that signature grin that made people trust him, believe him. "I have an announcement to make," he began, pausing just long enough for anticipation to build. A personal one. The room was silent now. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes shifting between him and me, the devoted wife standing just a few feet away, waiting to hear what my husband had to say. Eric exhaled, as if steadying himself for the weight of his own words. Then he said it. "I'm getting married." At first, there was no reaction. A ripple of confused whispers spread through the room. Someone chuckled, assuming it was a joke. After all, wasn't he already married? To me? But Eric wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. Emma, his personal assistant. A young woman, no older than 30, stood near the stage, frozen under the weight of 100 stares. The deep blue silk of her gown clung to her figure, the thigh-high slit showing off long, toned legs. A gown that was likely purchased with company funds. Her golden hair was swept into an elegant updo, loose strands framing a face that was just pretty enough to be memorable but not remarkable. And on her wrist? A diamond bracelet that looked painfully familiar. My diamond bracelet. The one Eric had gifted me years ago on my birthday, claiming it was one of a kind. A murmur of disbelief rolled through the crowd. Some guests turned toward me, their eyes darting back and forth between the betrayed wife and the woman my husband had just announced his engagement to. I let them look. I smiled. Calm. Controlled. Even as my fingers tightened around the stem of my glass, even as the room blurred at the edges, I kept my expression serene. Because this moment, his moment, had been months in the making. Not by him. By me. I counted the seconds in my head, waiting for the inevitable fallout. A few guests had the good sense to look horrified. Others whispered amongst themselves, disbelief flickering across their faces. One of Eric's colleagues, Gregory Hawthorne, the CFO, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His wife, Miranda, leaned in and murmured something in his ear. "Surely, he doesn't mean that," she whispered. But Eric wasn't finished. He stepped closer to the microphone, either too blind or too arrogant to see the damage he was doing. "I know this may come as a surprise to some of you," he continued, his voice smooth. "But love works in unexpected ways. Emma has been my rock these past few years, and I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He reached a hand toward Emma, beckoning her forward. She hesitated. A smart woman would have turned and walked away. A smart woman would have known that no man who could do this to his wife of 15 years would ever be worth standing beside. But Emma wasn't smart. She stepped forward, slipping her hand into his. The crowd's reaction was immediate. A mixture of polite applause, gasps, and awkward shifting in seats. A few executives looked toward me, waiting, perhaps, for some kind of outburst. But I wasn't going to give them that. I simply took another sip of my champagne, my hand steady as I watched the moment unfold. Eric might have thought this was his big reveal, the moment he took control of his own life and threw away the woman he had outgrown. He had no idea. Because while he had been planning this moment, I had been planning something far greater. Soon, his family's century-old empire would belong to someone else. And the best part? He wouldn't see it coming. The applause was awkward, hesitant. The kind that came when people weren't sure whether they were supposed to clap at all. A few guests clinked their glasses together out of habit, while others exchanged murmurs of disbelief. But I remained silent. I let Eric have his moment. Because that's all it would be, a fleeting moment before the floor beneath him crumbled. I swirled the champagne in my glass, my fingers tracing slow circles along the rim. From across the room, Eric caught my gaze. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across his face. He had expected rage, tears, a scene. Instead, I smiled. And that smile made him nervous. Good. I had spent the past 6 months preparing for this, carefully orchestrating every step, ensuring that when the time came, I wouldn't just walk away from this marriage with my dignity, I'd walk away with everything. It had started with curiosity, a gut feeling that something wasn't right. Then, it became an investigation. While Eric was away on his frequent business trips, ones I later confirmed were spent in private villas with Emma, I was meeting with my attorney. Not a divorce lawyer. Not yet. A corporate attorney. One who specialized in hostile takeovers. See, Eric had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated me. He had spent years treating me like nothing more than an accessory to his life. A well-dressed, well-mannered trophy wife who attended charity galas, played the doting hostess at dinner parties, and nodded along politely whenever men in suits talked about business. He never realized that while he was busy squandering the family fortune on affairs and luxury, I was listening. I was learning. And I was preparing. While Eric was carelessly funneling company funds into personal expenses, I was documenting every single unauthorized transaction, every flight he booked under fake business expenses, every dollar that went missing. Then I took it a step further. I started attending investment meetings in his place. At first, it was unassuming, just sitting in, taking notes, making polite conversation. The board members dismissed me as nothing more than Eric's wife, playing around in the corporate world to entertain myself. But then I started offering ideas. Ideas that worked. Ideas that made people listen. And one person, in particular, had been paying close attention. Dan Holmes, CEO of Syntech Group. Syntech had been Eric's biggest competitor for years. A rival company that had been circling like a shark, waiting for the right moment to strike. Dan had tried, more than once, to acquire Eric's company. But Eric, in all his arrogance, had dismissed him at every turn. So, when I walked into Dan's office 6 months ago, armed with financial reports, internal documents, and a proposal, he listened. He listened very carefully. Because I didn't just offer him the chance to buy out Eric's company. I offered him a golden opportunity. An inside takeover. One that would leave Eric with absolutely nothing. Mrs. Caldwell, Dan had said, setting down the thick folder of documents I had handed him. This is quite an interesting proposal. I had watched him closely, searching for any sign of hesitation. But there was none. He wasn't just interested, he was impressed. I take it your husband doesn't know you have these? He asked, tapping a finger against the financial reports that exposed every single one of Eric's reckless business decisions. No, I had said smoothly. And he won't. Not until it's too late. Dan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. What do you want out of this? Everything. I want complete financial security, I said. I want shares in Syntech. I want to ensure that when Eric falls, I land safely on higher ground. Dan had smiled, spoken like a true businesswoman. And just like that, the deal had been set in motion. Now, standing in that grand ballroom, watching Eric bask in his short-lived triumph, I counted the hours. Tomorrow morning, he would wake up to a very different world. One where his access to the company would be revoked. One where the board, his own board, would be convening an emergency meeting without him. One where Syntech's acquisition offer, carefully structured and finalized behind his back, would be signed. I could already picture the moment when Eric would walk into his office, only to find that it was no longer his. I sipped my champagne, allowing myself to savor the thought. Emma, still standing beside him, looked hesitant, unsure. She had expected me to cry, to scream, to make a dramatic exit. Instead, I turned toward her, lifting my glass in a silent toast. She swallowed hard, gripping Eric's arm a little tighter. Eric, still oblivious, grinned at the crowd, thanking them for their support. Support that was already wavering. I caught Gregory Hawthorne's eye across the room, the CFO who had spent the past few weeks secretly feeding me internal reports. He nodded. Everything was set. Tomorrow, Eric Caldwell's empire would collapse. And I would be the one holding the match. The morning after the gala, the house was silent. I stood in the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in my hands, watching the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The early morning light bathed everything in gold, a stark contrast to the storm that was about to hit. Upstairs, Eric was still asleep. He had come home late, well past midnight, a little drunk but undeniably victorious. He had waltzed in with the swagger of a man who thought he had won. I had been waiting in bed, feigning sleep as he slid under the covers beside me. He didn't say a word. And I didn't ask. He believed that I had accepted my fate. That I had bowed out quietly, resigned to the role of the discarded wife. Fool. I glanced at the clock. 8 a.m. Right on schedule. I reached for my phone and sent a single message to a number labeled Final Move. It's time. The response came almost instantly. Everything is set. He'll know soon. A slow smile spread across my lips. The first domino had fallen. By 8:30 a.m., the first call came in. Eric had just stumbled downstairs, still in his robe, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He poured himself a cup of coffee, barely acknowledging me as he checked his phone. Then, his face changed. His brows furrowed. His jaw tightened. He lowered the mug and dialed a number. Greg, what the hell is this? I sipped my coffee watching. He listened for a few seconds before his expression darkened. What do you mean an emergency board meeting? Who the hell called it? Pause. His eyes flickered toward me. I didn't blink. Without me. His voice rose, anger creeping into his tone. That's not possible. I would have. Silence. Then, I'm on my way. He ended the call, slamming his phone onto the counter. Something wrong? I asked, my voice smooth, casual. He looked at me, suspicion creeping into his eyes. I have to go. Something's happening at the office. I tilted my head. Something like what? He hesitated. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know how much I knew. Instead of answering, he turned and stormed upstairs. Moments later, I heard the shower running. I exhaled, setting my coffee down. Showtime. By the time Eric arrived at the office, his worst nightmare was already in motion. His key card didn't work. He tried once. Twice. Then a third time, harder, as if sheer force would change the outcome. Nothing. Confusion flickered across his face as he stepped back, glancing around. Employees walked past him, their gazes lingering just a little too long before quickly looking away. Something was wrong. And then, Mr. Caldwell. Eric turned. Two security guards stood before him, their expressions neutral, professional. You need to come with us. Eric scoffed, straightening. Excuse me? The board meeting is already in session, one of them said. You've been asked to wait in the lobby. Like hell I will, he snapped. This is my company. I built it. The guard didn't budge. Sir, please don't make this difficult. Eric's nostrils flared. He looked over his shoulder, searching for allies, for someone, anyone, who would reassure him that this was all just some ridiculous mistake. But the employees who normally cowered in his presence suddenly had somewhere else to be. No one would look at him. No one spoke. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't in control anymore. His steps were slow, almost hesitant, as he followed security through the pristine lobby. The same lobby he had walked through 1,000 times, always with his head high, always with that confident stride. But today, his kingdom was crumbling. And he was the last to know. Inside the boardroom, I sat at the long mahogany table, my hands folded neatly in front of me. Gregory Hawthorne sat at the head, flipping through a thick folder of documents. Dan Holmes, CEO of Syntech, sat beside him, cool and collected. The rest of the board members were silent, their expressions unreadable. The air was thick with tension. A woman from legal, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, cleared her throat. Let's get started. She slid a folder toward Gregory, who took his time before speaking. As you all know, he began, this meeting was called to discuss recent findings regarding financial mismanagement, unauthorized transactions, and unethical use of company funds. Across the table, one of the older board members sighed, rubbing his temple. The evidence we've gathered is substantial. No one looked surprised. They all knew. They had known for a while. They had just been waiting for someone to push the first domino. I leaned back, a slow breath leaving my lips. Everything was going according to plan. Eric was still pacing in the lobby when the boardroom doors finally opened. He spun around, relief flashing in his eyes when he saw Gregory stepping out. Greg, he exhaled, moving toward him. What the hell is going on? Gregory didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing me. Eric froze. His confusion deepened, followed quickly by something else. Realization. You, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I met his gaze. Held it. Me, I confirmed. His jaw clenched. What did you do? I stepped forward, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. I did what you never saw coming, I murmured. I outplayed you. Eric inhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists. You don't know what you're talking about. I smiled. Don't I? Behind me, Dan Holmes stepped forward. Mr. Caldwell, he said, his voice calm, composed. Syntech Group has officially acquired controlling interest in Caldwell Industries. Effective immediately, you are no longer CEO. Eric's face drained of color. No, he breathed. Yes, Dan corrected. The board voted unanimously. Eric turned to Gregory. You can't. We did, Gregory said simply. And frankly, Eric, it was long overdue. Eric looked around wildly, his panic growing. His world was caving in. And I had handed him the shovel. The security guards took another step forward. Sir, one of them said. It's time for you to leave. Eric's eyes darted back to me, rage and betrayal swirling in his gaze. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, Eric Caldwell had nothing to say. I stepped past him, brushing my fingers over his shoulder as I whispered. This was never your empire, Eric. I turned to leave, my heels clicking against the polished floor. It was mine. And with that, I walked away. Eric didn't leave. Not right away. Even as security stood beside him, waiting for him to accept reality, he just stood there, frozen in the lobby of what was once his company. I didn't stop to watch the full unraveling. I had nothing left to say to him. I walked past him without a glance, feeling his eyes burn into my back. But as I reached the glass doors leading outside, I heard it. Wait. I paused. Slowly, I turned around. His face was no longer a picture of anger. It was something worse. Panic. Desperation. You can't do this, he said, shaking his head as if trying to will the words away. You're my wife. The words would have meant something once. Not anymore. Correction, I said, tilting my head. I was your wife. You made sure I wouldn't be for much longer, remember? He swallowed hard. That was different. This is business. This is my company. Was your company, I reminded him, my voice calm, unwavering. You lost it the second you got distracted playing house with your assistant. His jaw tightened, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He still didn't understand how this had happened. How I had done this. He took a step toward me, lowering his voice. You don't get it, he whispered. I can fix this. We can fix this. Just tell them you made a mistake. A mistake? I let out a soft laugh. Oh, Eric. I sighed, shaking my head. The only mistake I made was marrying you in the first place. His nostrils flared. You're not capable of running this company. Neither were you, I countered smoothly. That's why I had to clean up your mess. He scoffed, running a hand through his hair, his confidence still desperately trying to hold on. This is a bluff. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but… Game? I repeated, stepping closer. I let the word settle between us before I pulled my phone from my purse. With a few taps, I pulled up an email, one he hadn't seen yet. Then, without breaking eye contact, I turned the screen toward him. His face drained of color. His own signature stared back at him from the digital contract he had signed weeks ago. The document that gave Syntech Group the right to assume control of his company in the event of a financial crisis, one I had carefully manufactured, documented, and exposed to the board. You did this. His voice was barely a whisper now. I tucked my phone back into my purse. No, Eric. I met his eyes, letting him see the victory written all over my face. You did this to yourself. 30 minutes later, Eric was gone. Escorted out of the building by security, with the entire office watching. He didn't put up a fight. Not after seeing the paperwork. Not after realizing that every board member, every investor, and every executive had already moved on without him. Not after realizing that, for the first time in his life, he had lost. I stood in my new office, his old office, overlooking the city's skyline, sipping the coffee one of the assistants had nervously placed on my desk. It was strange how small this moment felt. I had spent months preparing for this. Planning, strategizing, outplaying him. But now that it was done, now that Eric Caldwell had been erased from the company he once controlled, it wasn't relief I felt. It wasn't even triumph. It was something colder, emptier. Perhaps I had expected more satisfaction. Perhaps I had thought that watching him fall would give me some sense of closure. But the truth was, I had already made peace with my anger long before today. This wasn't about revenge. It was about taking back what was rightfully mine. And I had done exactly that. I was still staring out the window when there was a knock at my office door. Gregory Hawthorne stepped inside, carrying a folder under his arm. Congratulations, he said, offering a small, knowing smile. You got exactly what you wanted. I turned, raising a brow. Did I? Greg paused, studying me. Then he chuckled. You don't seem as happy as I thought you'd be. I leaned against the desk, setting my coffee down. I don't know what I expected. Well, I'll tell you what you can expect, he said, tossing the folder onto my desk. A lot of paperwork. And a lot of damage control. Eric ran this company into the ground. I already knew that. That's why I had been so certain the board would side with me, because Eric hadn't just been a bad husband. He had been a terrible businessman. I need full financial reports by the end of the day, I said, flipping open the folder. We need to see exactly how much damage he did before we start restructuring. Greg nodded, but before he left, he hesitated. Did he ever see it coming? He asked. I smiled faintly, shaking my head. Not until it was too late. Greg let out a low whistle. Remind me never to get on your bad side. I let out a soft laugh. Don't betray me, and you'll be just fine. Greg smirked before exiting the office, leaving me alone once again. By evening, news of Eric's downfall had spread. It was all over the financial world. News outlets were running headlines dissecting how one of the most powerful men in the industry had been outmaneuvered. Analysts speculated, insiders whispered, and stock values fluctuated as investors scrambled to understand what had just happened. One executive rise. Another executive falls. That's how the game worked. Eric had spent years playing it carelessly, recklessly. And now? Now he had lost. I watched the news coverage for a moment, sipping a glass of wine in the penthouse suite I had quietly moved into weeks ago. Eric was gone. Emma, from what I had heard, had packed up her things and vanished as well, likely realizing that she had hitched her future to a sinking ship. The company was mine now. Everything was mine. But as I set down my glass and turned off the TV, I realized something. The game wasn't over. It never would be. Eric had been a fool, but he wasn't the only one. The business world was full of men just like him, men who underestimated the women standing beside them. Men who thought we were just accessories. Just placeholders. Just wives. They thought we were content to sit pretty while they played their little power games. They were wrong. I had one today. But tomorrow? Tomorrow, the real work began. And I was ready. Eric had lost everything. His company. His reputation. His carefully constructed image of success. But the true weight of his downfall wouldn't hit him until tomorrow. Tomorrow, when the headlines would run with not just the news of his removal, but the details of his financial ruin. When he'd realized that his once loyal investors had already jumped ship. When his bank accounts, so carelessly used to fund his lavish lifestyle, would be frozen, audited, and picked apart. He had spent years treating me like a woman who needed him. Now, he'd find out what it was like to need me. And I had no intention of being merciful. The next morning, I was already in my office when Greg walked in, shaking his head as he set a thick folder down on my desk. "You might want to take a look at this," he said, sliding it toward me. I opened it. Inside was a breakdown of Eric's personal finances, his accounts, investments, and assets. Or rather, what was left of them. "Jesus," Greg muttered. He bled himself dry. I leaned back in my chair, flipping through page after page of extravagant, unnecessary spending. Luxury cars. Private jets. Weekends at five-star resorts. And Emma, oh, she had been expensive. Flights, jewelry, designer dresses, an apartment in the city paid for with company money. All of it gone. The only thing left in his name was our marital home. And he wouldn't even have that for much longer. I set the folder down and turned to my laptop, clicking on an email from my lawyer. Divorce proceedings initiated. Property assets will be reassessed within 48 hours. By the end of the week, my name would be the only one on the deed to the house. By the end of the month, Eric Caldwell would have nothing left. Not even a place to call home. Eric's moment of realization came at 3:17 p.m. I knew because that was the exact moment my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Instead, I let it ring out, watching as my assistant stepped into the office a moment later, looking slightly uncomfortable. Your husband, ex-husband, is in the lobby." I glanced up from my computer. "Eric?" I hadn't expected him to show his face here so soon. "Did he say why?" I asked, arching a brow. My assistant hesitated. He just keeps saying he needs to talk to you." I exhaled slowly, setting my laptop aside. "Send him up." Her brows lifted in surprise, but she nodded and stepped out. A few minutes later, the elevator doors slid open. And there he was. Eric looked nothing like the man who had walked onto that stage 2 nights ago, full of confidence and bravado. His suit was slightly wrinkled, like he had thrown it on in a hurry. His tie was missing. His eyes, once so sure, so smug, were frantic, darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. I let the silence stretch as he stepped inside. "Rebecca," he said finally, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I didn't answer. I just leaned back in my chair, waiting. His jaw tensed. "This has gone too far." I let out a soft, amused breath. "Has it?" "You've made your point," he said, stepping closer. "I screwed up. But you've taken everything." I tilted my head. "Funny. That's exactly what you were planning to do to me." His mouth opened, then shut. "You had an affair, Eric. You spent our money on your mistress. You were going to humiliate me in front of everyone we know and expect me to just take it." His throat bobbed. "I didn't think you would." "What?" "Fight back?" I smiled. "That was your first mistake." His hands clenched into fists. "This company was my family's legacy. And you ran it into the ground, I said coolly. You didn't lose it because of me, Eric. You lost it because of you. His shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. Then, unexpectedly, his expression softened. He took another step forward, lowering his voice. Rebecca. I raised a brow. I know we ended badly, he said, his voice taking on a practiced sincerity. But we built something together. You know this industry is ruthless. I made mistakes, but I held up a hand, cutting him off. Are you actually trying to get me to feel sorry for you? His lips parted slightly, caught off guard. You chose this, I continued. Every choice you made led you here. The cheating, the lies, the reckless spending. You chose to betray me. You chose to sabotage your own company. And now you're standing in my office, hoping I'll what? Save you. His face darkened. You wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for me. I smiled slowly. You're right. If I had never married you, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to take everything you owned. He flinched. I guess that makes us even. His hands curled into fists again, his face contorting with barely contained rage. But there was nothing he could do. Not anymore. He had played his hand. And I had won. By the time Eric left my office, his fate had been sealed. I received a text from my attorney 10 minutes later. He accepted the divorce terms. No fight. No claims. I stared at the message for a moment before setting my phone down. It was done. Completely. Finally. The man who had once thought he held all the power had walked away with nothing. I exhaled slowly, staring out at the skyline. Tomorrow, the world would move on. Business would continue. The company would recover. My life would rebuild. And Eric Caldwell? He would be nothing more than a cautionary tale. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline that evening, the world had already moved on. The financial news channels ran headline after headline about the Caldwell Industries takeover. Experts dissected every misstep Eric had made, every reckless decision that had led to his downfall. Reporters speculated about his next move, but I already knew there was no next move. His reputation was in shambles. His financial accounts were frozen. His investors had turned their backs on him. And me? I was still standing. I was still winning. Eric didn't try to contact me again. Not directly, anyway. But the whispers reached me. Rumors of him trying and failing to secure a new position. Of former colleagues hesitating to return his calls. Of Emma, his once adoring mistress, packing her things and leaving town the moment she realized there was nothing left for her. I had been right about her. She had loved the money, the power. Not him. Without either of those things, he was just Eric Caldwell. And that wasn't enough. Not for Emma. Not for anyone. I heard he was staying at a hotel now, an overpriced suite that he wouldn't be able to afford for much longer. His assets were dwindling fast, and soon he'd have to sell the house. My house. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the night he had stood on that stage, announcing his new engagement like I was nothing. I remembered the way he had expected me to just disappear. And I smiled. 1 month later. Caldwell Industries was thriving under Syntex management. Investors who had once hesitated were now flooding in, eager to be part of the company's rebirth. Stocks soared. Profits climbed. The transition had been smoother than expected, mostly because I had done all the work before the takeover had even happened. And as for me, I was doing better than ever. With my shares in Syntech, I now had more wealth, more power, more control than I ever did when I was married to Eric. For the first time in years, I wasn't someone's wife. I wasn't someone's shadow. I was my own person. And I had no intention of ever letting a man like Eric or anyone else take that away from me again. 6 months later, the last piece of my revenge fell into place when I saw the article. It was buried under bigger financial news, barely a footnote in a world that had long since forgotten him. Former CEO Eric Caldwell declares bankruptcy. I read it while sipping my morning coffee, a smirk tugging at my lips. I had expected it, of course. But seeing it in print? That was something else entirely. The mighty Eric Caldwell, the man who once thought he was untouchable, had officially lost everything. And me? I had everything I had ever wanted. Wealth, power, freedom, victory. 1 year later, I never saw Eric again. Not in person, anyway. But sometimes I wondered if he ever thought about me. If he ever lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of whatever cheap apartment he was living in now, wondering how the hell he had let everything slip through his fingers. If he ever truly understood that he had done this to himself. That I hadn't ruined him. He had. I had only made sure he felt it. And I had no regrets. I had built something bigger than him, bigger than our marriage. And in the end,